Ninth episode opens around 1779. Claire, Jamie, and young Ian have returned to Scotland, partly to escort Brigadier General Simon Fraser's body back to his homeland, but also to touch base with families still living on the Fraser estate of Lallybroch while they're in the area. It's not a permanent stay when we already know that Claire and Jamie have every intention of going back to Fraser's Ridge and building themselves a new home to replace the one that burned down in the fire. But this episode allows the three of them to tie up some very important loose ends. Their arrival at Lallybroch isn't the warmest on all fronts, even if it's been some time since young Ian has seen his family. He earns a warm hug from Jenny and similar greetings from his older siblings. But the situation with his father is much more complicated, as Ian's health has worsened significantly since we last returned to Lallybroch. Claire astutely diagnoses the man with consumption at a glance, but there's little that can be done apart from making Ian comfortable in his final days. Amid their conversations with the family, during which young Ian's brother Michael, recently arrived from Paris, reveals that the wine business is still doing well despite new tensions between England and France, Claire realizes that she has to divulge what she knows about the future and the impending revolution that will take place in 1789. In private with Jamie, she concludes that she needs to tell the Maes the truth about her being a time traveler, especially since Ian is nearing his end. They may not be able to stop major historical events that are meant to take place, but they've still achieved small victories, like Jamie surviving Culloden when he was originally meant to have died. Sitting around the table with the Maes, Claire warns Michael about remaining in Paris past 1788, and when the truth is finally out, the family seems to have trouble grasping the concept of time travel. Is Claire a fairy woman? Is she an old one? Maybe it doesn't really matter, but it does lead Jenny to think that Claire could somehow cure Ian of his illness. There's no way for Claire to concoct any solution by medicinal means, though, in this time, and contrary to what the Maes believe, she's not magic either. The mood between the two women is distinctly frostier after that, although Jenny does attempt to make amends for literally calling Claire soulless after a much-needed pep talk from her brother. Time in Scotland is ultimately short-lived. Claire receives a letter from Lord John Grey informing her of his nephew Henry's grievous injury in battle. Physicians have attempted to remove the musket balls that are still lodged in Henry's abdomen, but failed. John insists that Claire is the only one who can successfully perform the operation in Philadelphia, where his nephew is currently convalescing. Her departure, however, means she and Jamie will have to split up for a time while Jamie stays behind in Scotland. Similarly, young Ian wrestles with whether to remain with his family for his father's final days before being encouraged to accompany Claire to Philadelphia by both Jenny and Ian, so that he can pursue his Quaker lady love, Rachel Hunter. As Jamie and Claire say their goodbyes by the wagon, Ian realizes his father has mustered up enough strength to come outside and send him off, and both Ians share a meaningful, tender embrace with the knowledge that it will be their last. Outlander's return brings with it something that the show has never done before: a Roger voiceover. We've been privy to Claire's inner thoughts before, and occasionally Jamie's musings via letter, but this choice puts us in Roger's head in a completely different way. There's no time for either him or us to dwell on that major change, though, now that he and his ancestor, Buck Mackenzie, have successfully traveled back through the stones in pursuit of Roger's son, Jeremiah. As far as Roger or any of us know, Jemmy's been kidnapped by Brianna's slimy co-worker Rob Cameron, who intends to take the boy to America, where he can successfully acquire a buried cache of Jacobite gold. While Buck's come through the stones a little worse for the wear, clutching his chest and wheezing, he and Roger agree to split up so they can search more ground, with Buck heading towards Inverness and Roger trekking to the past's version of Lallybroch, assuming Jem would still know the way back to the home they own in the present timeline. Well, the 1980s, that is. The episode does something else particularly tricksy at the halfway mark, initially convincing us that Roger has gone back through the stones to the same time as Jamie and Claire. But when the door at Lallybroch opens, it isn't Jamie or Claire who answers it, but Jamie's father, Brian Fraser. Roger is in the wrong time, since we know that Brian died 2 years before Jamie first crossed paths with Claire in 1743. That doesn't confirm exactly which time this is just yet, but it does narrow things down, especially when Roger meets a younger version of Jenny, who is yet to marry Ian Murray. Word of a strangely dressed man has also apparently spread through the village, but Roger's inquiries are cut short when he learns that Buck fell ill on his way back from Inverness. There's no healer within a close distance, but there is a herbalist who might be able to lend a hand. That herbalist? None other than Guileless Duncan, and Roger's voiceover reaction is all of our reactions when he lays eyes on his much more diabolical fellow time traveler. 10th episode opens with a flashback, and if you thought this moment would also double as a backdoor pilot for the planned prequel series Outlander, Blood of My Blood, think again. It is a scene of fond reminiscence, though, as we observe a much younger version of Jamie and his brother Willie learning an important lesson about watching each other's backs, both on the battlefield and off. Years later, Jamie's sitting in that very spot with Ian as the two pass a flask back and forth, making each other chuckle as they reflect on the past. Jamie advises Ian not to risk coughing up a lung, for fear Jenny will kill him if her husband keels over, but also expresses the sentiment that he's loved Ian like a brother since the day they made blood vows to protect each other as such. It's a beautiful moment that, sadly, proves to be short-lived. The very next scene finds Jamie lifting a weakened Ian into bed. After Jenny and Jamie each take one of Ian's hands in their own, Ian dies with his wife's name on his lips. Later, Jamie insists on digging the grave for Ian himself and promises to remain at Lallybroch for as long as he's needed. He does have every intention of joining Claire in Philadelphia, but there are other things to attend to first, like visiting Joan at her new convent in Paris, before moving on to the city of brotherly love. He offers Jenny a home with him and Claire on Fraser's Ridge, and Jenny admits she might consider it one day, or at least after the American Revolution has ended and her children have grown enough to need her around less. After a 5-week crossing, Claire and young Ian are in a carriage making their way through the streets of Philadelphia. Travel doesn't come smoothly with the city under British occupation, especially when rumors of spies are running rampant, but the redcoat checking travelers only glances at Ian's papers before waving them through. Apparently, women aren't considered much of a threat, but more on that later. The two split up, with Ian planning to ride to the Valley Forge encampment to search for Rachel Hunter, while Claire continues on to the house of a woman named Mercy Woodwalk to perform surgery on Lord John Grey's nephew Henry. Claire and John catch each other up on everything that's happened. He resigned his commission in the British Army, but still wears the uniform for intimidation purposes, especially since Mercy is pro-independence. After examining Henry, Claire's informed that one musket ball still remains after the young man was shot twice in the abdomen. The other was removed by Denzel Hunter, Rachel's brother. As the two physicians meet up and nerd out over surgical talk, Claire learns that Rachel has accompanied her brother to Philadelphia, rather than remaining in Valley Forge. Fortunately, Outlander is only giving us a smaller version of what could have been a much bigger missed connection this week. As Rachel and William Ransom are doing some shopping, accompanied by Ian's trusted four-legged companion Rollo, the half-wolf seems to catch the scent of his owner and takes off running. Rachel loses Rollo in the crowds, but as she calls out for Ian, someone else is listening, Archbug, who seems to have been tracking Rachel all this time with revenge against Ian on his mind. Ian and Rollo reunite, so at least he knows that Rachel is close by. But what will he discover when he finally finds her? Later, Denzel and Mercy assist Claire with Henry's surgery, where Denzel marvels at the ability to cut into someone without waking them up at all, thanks to the use of ether. John, with his back turned, fights not to throw up into his own surgical mask as Claire searches through Henry's intestine to discover that the remaining bullet is trapped inside, with the metal having been hot enough to cauterize the intestinal wall behind it. It'll involve a resection, but Claire's confident in her abilities, and Henry successfully makes it through the long surgery. Meanwhile, Rachel continues her search for Rollo in the stables, and is instead grabbed by Bug, who threatens to kill her, but promises he'll wait until after Ian finds her, so he can watch his love die. Rachel tries to appeal to Bug's better nature, questioning the value of vengeance on a moral as well as a spiritual level. And of course, that's the exact moment when Ian arrives. Confronting the old man, Ian earns an axe wound in the arm during the struggle, and Bug briefly gets the upper hand, but then William arrives, shooting the man dead. It's a somewhat anticlimactic ending to this long-running revenge plot, with William essentially getting friend-zoned in the process, but it also leads to a fireside confession from Ian about his love for Rachel, so almost everyone gets what they wanted in the end. By the time Claire receives word from Jamie, it's been 6 weeks since the date of his letter, in which he confirms the passing of older Ian and reveals he's been hanging out with Benjamin Franklin's social circle in Paris. But he's also booked passage on a ship bound for Philadelphia, so he's already well on his way. In fact, he could show up any day now. But Claire has another problem on her hands. Mercy reveals she's been working as a spy for the rebels, couriering coded messages out of Philadelphia, but she's recently been followed. Claire offers to deliver the latest message intended for General Washington herself, since the contents of her basket are never searched when she goes out foraging in the community garden beyond the city walls. Something tells us this plan will eventually backfire, but there's no time to dwell. At John's house, Claire is met with a stunned expression from her host. He can barely get the words out. Jamie's ship has been lost at sea with no survivors found. Claire's first response is denial, even after she's presented with the manifest that lists her husband's name among the passengers. "I would feel it in my heart if his had stopped. Do you understand?" Claire cries. "Mine would stop too." A long night unfolds for Claire, with unending tears and imagining Jamie's face among the ocean waves. But morning dawns harshly when Captain Ezekiel Richardson arrives at the house, revealing he's there to arrest Claire as a rebel spy. Thinking fast, John claims Claire has gone to church to mourn, but Richardson says he can only give them a day before returning to take her into custody. After Richardson departs, John lets himself into Claire's room and offers his protection to her the only way he knows how, through marriage. It's certainly a noble gesture, but on the other hand, Claire Randall Fraser Gray is a bit of a mouthful. Meanwhile, Outlander finally confirms when Roger and Buck Mackenzie have inadvertently traveled to 1739, 4 years before Claire herself goes back through the stones. We pick up with them after their surprising face-to-face meeting with Gillis Duncan, though Roger is the only one with any real understanding of how they all know each other, since Buck is unaware of who his birth mother really is. Roger quickly explains away any initial awkwardness by referring to Gillis's younger age. He would have expected any woman with knowledge of the old ways to be much more mature, of course. But Gillis is struck by a strange feeling of recognition when she gets closer to examine Buck herself, even if she can't explain why. After Gillis leaves the room to fetch herbs for a remedy, Roger clues Buck in on a few details about Gillis. Her real name, her belief in blood sacrifice, and the fact that she's another time traveler, while conveniently leaves out the details about her being Buck's birth mother in the process. Later, Gillis attempts to cozy up to Roger in private to gain more information about him, but there's more than one reason why he doesn't want to sleep with his many times great-grandmother, including the fact that he's a married man. He does give her the truth about Jem's kidnapping and tries to sniff out whether she ever met Rob Cameron, but the name doesn't seem to spark any recognition. A knock at the door brings with it some new visitors, including Dougal Mackenzie. He hands off a pair of dog tags to Roger engraved with the name J.W. Mackenzie, but those initials aren't Jeremiah's. As Dougal and Gillis have their official meet-cute and sneak off to peruse her wares, Roger grapples with the possibility that his father may not have gone missing in action, as he'd always believed. What if he'd actually traveled through time during World War II, all the way back to 1739? 11th episode, titled 100 Weight of Stones, as Claire navigates through the darkest nights of her very soul while forced into a marriage of inconvenience with someone who arguably loved her husband as much as she did. The camera moves back and forth between the newlyweds with unflinching closeness, as William Ransom stands in witness to two people joining their houses in resigned sorrow. Seeing Jamie's son at the moment when she nearly falters in her vows, it turns out, is what gives Claire the strength to finish them. John slides a gold ring on her finger alongside Jamie's, and it's official. Claire is now Lady John Grey, even if she doesn't waste any time before taking said ring off and crawling right back into bed. She's not the only one grieving Jamie's loss, as Ian says a prayer for his uncle's soul out in the woods, with Rachel, Hunter, and Rollo by his side. The two briefly ponder the potential of a life after this one. Quakers consider their time on earth to be a sacrament in itself, Rachel says, but not all of them necessarily believe in a heaven. It's still a comfort for Ian to think of Jamie there, though, keeping his father company. Rachel remarks on how much Ian has lost over the course of his young life. But something's got to give soon, right? Let's cut these characters a break eventually. On their walk back into town, Ian feels compelled to reveal more of his past to Rachel, including the fact that he was married before. Rachel's less than thrilled to learn that said wife is still alive, but she's at least willing to hear Ian out in terms of recounting what led to their separation. Once she has all of that past trauma spelled out for her, Rachel's also willing to confess to her own love for Ian, initiating a kiss between them. Later, when Ian meets with Claire, revealing that he intends to leave with Rachel for Valley Forge, he admits that he isn't sure if his aunt plans to go back through the stones to her own time. But Claire realizes that home, for her, is in the past now, as is the fight she needs to continue to see through for Jamie's sake, as well as the rest of their family. Meanwhile, back in 1739 Scotland, Roger is beginning to think there's a reason why he and Buck were brought back to this time. Maybe, in tracking down his own father, who may very well have disappeared through the stones rather than gone missing in action, the trail will also lead Roger to his son. He's following every possible breadcrumb, including an old RAF jacket, but its new owner threatens Roger and Buck into leaving empty-handed. Buck rightly points out that finding Roger's father may not actually lead them to Jeremiah, but Roger can't shake the feeling that all of this is somehow connected, as if he was meant to find his father by winding up in the wrong time. Still, it's hard not to consider the possibility that this might all be a wild goose chase, and our worst fears are somewhat confirmed when, back in the 80s at Lallybroch, Brianna finds herself facing off against none other than Rob Cameron. She quickly deduces that Rob had left Jeremiah's scarf at the stones to trick Roger into going back into the past. Their son has been right under their noses all along. But Jeremiah is proving less than helpful in giving Rob the answers he wants, so he's here for Brianna to ensure she gets her son to cooperate. They'll fly to America, Rob will find the gold, and they can all go their separate ways. But Brianna doesn't let it get that far, grabbing the nearest pot on the kitchen counter and knocking Rob out with it. While Claire's marriage to John could certainly be seen as impulsive, William is the first one to point out that it might also do damage to Lord Grey's reputation, what with Claire being a heavily rumored rebel and all. He's speaking from about as well-informed a place as he can, which is to say, not very informed at all, at least not about the truth pertaining to Jamie or John's true feelings for him, or the fact that he's actually William's real father. To give the kid some credit, he's just trying to look out for John, and what's more, he doesn't understand why John owes Jamie so much after all these years. Protecting Jamie's wife, as well as his son, with the power of his name and title, seems to be the least that John can do at this point. But there's only so much protection that John can offer when Claire is considering making a decision that she can't come back from. Alone in her room, Claire's despair reaches such a low that she goes as far as to take a scalpel to her arm, intent on cutting herself deep enough to bleed out, thereby joining Jamie in death. But whose voice should she hear in her head but his, holding her back from the brink? Screaming in rage and grief, she reaches for the nearest bottle of strong liquor instead, to drown her sorrows. From the floor beneath, John sits before a chessboard in front of the fireplace, downing his own glasses of wine and trying not to consider the empty seat across from his own, one that Jamie himself would have occupied. As Claire wails, John stumbles upstairs, letting himself into her room and joining her on the floor. A messy, somewhat violent thing that passes between them, with Claire lashing out at him and John taking her into his arms as they weep together. One thing leads to another, and when morning dawns, well, they're both naked under the covers, feeling equally awkward about what transpired. John apologizes for being somewhat ungentlemanly over the pillow talk that plays out, but Claire points out that each of them had been picturing someone else the previous night. The conversation that plays out is sweet and understanding, and even if the event that preceded it is somewhat controversial, it feels like the two go their separate ways with a better, warmer understanding of each other from that point on. It also means that Claire is willing to call him out for putting his foot down about his nephew Henry's desire to marry Mercy Woodcock. Yet, as John puts it, he's only forbidden them to spare his nephew from imprisonment, or worse, as their marriage would not be widely recognized by law. This week, Claire's role as the new Lady John Grey unfortunately involves having to put on a happy face and attend the fundraiser that her husband is hosting to benefit the Loyalists. At first, it seems as though Claire might put her foot down about showing up, despite John's desperate insistence that they rely on each other to survive, thereby honoring Jamie's memory in the process. But on the night of, Claire appears, wearing both the blue gown John picked out for her and his ring nestled on her finger next to Jamie's. Over the course of the supper, she's also put in a position to discover one major secret. Captain Richardson might have threatened to arrest her as a rebel spy before, but that's because he's a double agent himself, outwardly a redcoat while secretly feeding information to the Patriots. Now, he wants to recruit Claire to spy on John and his Loyalist connections, but Claire refuses to go as far as to open her new family up to threats. The next morning, as Claire and John review the new party invitations that have arrived in the mail, who should stride through the door but Jamie himself? Turns out it was a manifest error that had him listed on that ill-fated ship. The only thing on board just so happened to be Jamie's luggage. Breaking up our favorite couple's joyous reunion, however, is the fact that William is standing in the hallway and has just overheard John referring to him as Jamie's son. As if things couldn't get more dramatic, several redcoats are also in hot pursuit of Mr. Fraser and closing in fast. With some quick and admittedly reckless thinking, Jamie puts a pistol to John's head, pretending to hold him hostage to make his escape. And amidst all the madness that only Outlander can deliver, Claire can't help but smile with sheer and utter happiness that her husband has just come back from the dead. 12th episode begins. In the wake of Jamie fleeing with John at mock gunpoint, a move designed to give him just enough time to stay one step ahead of the redcoats, Claire is left behind at the Grey house with William, who is not handling the truth about actually being a Scotsman all that well. After questioning Claire about the exact circumstances of his conception, details she is only so qualified to answer, given that she wasn't physically present for the act and can only explain based on what Jamie shared with her. William reveals that the apple apparently doesn't fall far from the tree in terms of hot-bloodedness, smashing vases, mirrors, and at least one chandelier as he storms out of the house. After that initial property damage, William at least seems like he's making an attempt to walk off his feelings when his furious rantings, mostly just referring to himself as a bastard over and over, catch the attention of a brothel worker, Arabella, who happens to be standing on the sidewalk. When she invites William inside for a glass of wine and a chance to cool off, the situation doesn't go all that smoothly. William is a maelstrom of emotions at this point, and unpredictable to boot, knocking a glass of wine out of Arabella's hand when she attempts to put a hand on his shoulder, and ultimately earning a bite from her in the tussle that follows. Suffice it to say, he hasn't made the best first impression, and departs from the room with his metaphorical tail tucked between his legs. The next day doesn't dawn any easier, if only because William is already feeling sour about everything and everyone around him, and then gets the news broken to him that Ian and Rachel intend to get married as soon as they can find someone to officiate the ceremony. It's the cherry on top of a terrible Sunday for William, who punches Ian in the face, seemingly out of nowhere, and then incites further retaliation when he confronts Ian about whether he knew the truth about Jamie. Ian, who believes anyone would be lucky to call his uncle their father, doesn't take much convincing to throw a punch of his own in Jamie's defense. Soon the two are squaring off and trading blows, but when redcoats intervene, William orders them to apprehend Ian. a cowardly choice that earns him a slap across the face from none other than Rachel, as she scolds him for forcing her to break her vow of nonviolence as a Quaker. At least later on, William's reluctantly willing to use his power of authority to have Ian set free from custody. But it's a gesture that Rachel isn't willing to acknowledge as she fixes William with a steely expression. Later that night, William's back in the brothel he fled from only hours before, as Captain Harkness and his men hold court in the sitting room, boasting openly and disgustingly about their own bedroom proclivities. Sensing that Harkness's intentions would amount to the equivalent of assault if he gets his hands on Arabella, William coughs up his own silver gorget to pay for a night with her before Harkness can stake his claim. Judging by the look on the captain's face, though, my guess is this threat might be lingering beyond this week's episode. Once in the room, William insists he only has gentlemanly intentions, and his vow is to let his company sleep. But Arabella, who reveals her real name to be Jane, takes matters into her own hands by inviting William into bed with her and then initiating sex between them, despite his protestations. Of all the weeks for William to have his first time, this one feels especially heavy. Meanwhile, Jamie has his hands full. He's got John as his pretend hostage, and the two men make it all the way out to the woods on horseback before the truth comes out. At first, it seems like Jamie might be reacting well to the reveal that his wife and his longtime friend slept together, having believed him to be dead at the time. But when John explicitly states that both he and Claire were imagining Jamie the whole time, it results in Jamie delivering the first punch of the episode. As they say in Outlander, John gets a strong thrashing by the time the opening credits finish, and has definitely looked better when he and Jamie's fight is broken up by a group of patrolling rebels. Jamie, likely still feeling sour about John and Claire's entanglement, is more than happy to turn John over into their custody under the assumption he'll merely be kept as a prisoner. But there's a complication that emerges. More on that later, though. Jamie not only has a delightful moment when he and Ian cross paths while the latter is in the custody of redcoats, but he also gets a new job, courtesy of George Washington himself. Turns out the general is very impressed by Jamie's efforts for the rebellion, so he offers Colonel Fraser his very own battalion to command, with an accompanying promotion to brigadier general. After that, Jamie moves to put the smackdown on William for retaliating against Ian, and threatens to blackmail his son by revealing his true origins to his fellow officers if he doesn't set his nephew free. Probably not the best start to these two attempting to have a genuine relationship, but their conversation pales in comparison to the one that Jamie needs to have with Claire as soon as he circles back to the Gray house. The scene that unfolds feels almost like the equivalent of a play, 10 uninterrupted minutes between husband and wife as they move throughout the house. First upstairs to Claire's room, where Jamie asks to hear all the dirty details about what happened between her and John that night, and then back down to the sitting room, where Jamie confesses to the jealousy he'll always have where his wife is concerned. It's not an easy conversation, and Jamie steps in it a few times while trying to understand why Claire and John may have reached for each other in his absence. But it's a testament to Hewen and Balfe's strengths with these characters that they can make this critical scene as compelling, heartbreaking, and romantic as it ultimately ends up becoming. It's no wonder, then, that by the end of it all, Claire and Jamie just want to make up in the best way they know how. By making love on top of the dining room table. Remember when Jamie delivered John into the hands of the rebels? It was probably meant as a form of light retaliation, what with Jamie still feeling salty about John sleeping with Claire and all, but what neither of them is aware of in the moment is exactly what John has in his jacket pocket: a letter from the British Army reinstating his military commission. With all the chaos around Jamie's surprise return, John hadn't had time to read all of his mail that day. It looks pretty bad for him when the rebels go through his pockets and read a commission he hasn't even had time to consider, much less accept. More damning is the fact that John is also related to a General Craigh who carried out a pretty big massacre on behalf of the Loyalists. With all the evidence stacked against him, it becomes increasingly clear that John is worth more dead than alive. But he ends up finding unexpected help when he's brought to the rebels' camp. Denzel Hunter, Rachel's brother, is currently serving as the camp's doctor, and not only tends to John's injuries from the beating Jamie gave him, chief among them a pretty messed up eye, but also smuggles John a knife that he can use to cut through his own bindings and escape in the middle of the night. It's this escape that gets interspersed with Jamie and Claire's, vigorous reunion as John slips into the woods with his captors hot on his heels, and all we hear is a gunshot before the episode cuts to black. 13th episode begins as we check back in with Brianna to discover that she's tied her son's kidnapper up and locked him in Lallybrock's priest hole, no longer of use in their time, but perfect for keeping Rob held. But Brianna's initial interrogation tactics, verbal threats, a hand around his throat, even a kick to the face, aren't enough to force Rob to spill information about Jemmy's whereabouts. And when Brianna attempts to call the police and fill them in, she discovers Rob has cut Lallybrock's phone lines. Watching her daughter Mandy handle a toy plane prompts an idea, though, and Brianna decides to start driving around to look for Jem herself. Mandy, meanwhile, acts as a makeshift compass of sorts, instructed to play hot or cold whenever she happens to feel her brother's presence nearby. It doesn't take long for Jem or us to figure out that Rob has shut him up in the mines, but Jem also takes after his parents, and eventually recalls Brianna's story about flipping on all the breakers to turn the lights on, not to mention turning at the right split in the tunnel. So maybe Brianna doesn't find Jem so much as Jem finds Brianna, because all of a sudden he's standing in the service road leading to the dam, caught in the car's headlights. By the time Brianna drives back to Lallybrock with both of her children, she also has a police escort, but she also discovers, with no shortage of horror, that Rob has escaped. The officers are less than helpful when it comes to taking Brianna's statement, with one of them even insinuating that she must have been having an affair with Rob, and certainly seem in no rush to go out and search for her son's kidnapper. With Lallybrock's phone still down, Brianna takes extra precautions to keep Jem and Mandy safe, sending them home with Ernie and Fiona Buchan, Mrs. Graham's granddaughter, the latter whom she privately confides in about Roger's current whereabouts. Back in Philadelphia, it's a mostly happy day as Ian and Rachel get ready for their wedding. There's an added level of celebration involved, given that everyone believed Jamie was dead up until very recently, and Ian reflects on how meaningful it is to have his uncle present, since his own parents aren't able to attend. The conversation soon turns to Ian's anxieties about what comes after the wedding, since it'll be Rachel's first time, at which point Jamie admits that Claire was the experienced one when they had their own wedding night. Advice from Dougal and Rupert and Angus had been basically useless at the time, so Jamie decides to impart some valuable wisdom to his nephew to ensure his future wife's satisfaction. Go slowly and pay attention. The rest should basically be second nature after that. Rachel's brother Denzel makes it just in time for the wedding, but before the ceremony begins, he fills Jamie in on a few pertinent details regarding Lord John Craigh, who hasn't been seen back in the city since fleeing captivity in last week's episode. Jamie clearly has regrets, not just about smashing John's face in, but also about the fact that his friend is still on the run and hasn't made attempts to contact him or anyone else. There's little time to dwell, though, as the wedding is about to begin. It's not your typical ceremony. Rachel mentions something about needing to listen to God's presence, but after a while, people are starting to get antsy. Rollo has fallen asleep, and even Jamie and Claire are whispering. Denzel and Jamie each give a speech, one going somewhat more smoothly than the other, but it's still an emotional day for everyone. As Ian and Rachel say heartfelt vows to each other in front of their dearest friends and family, there isn't a dry eye in the house after that. Cut ahead to the wedding night, and, well, there's no need to get into all the dirty details, is there? Suffice it to say, there are certainly moments reminiscent of Outlander's very first wedding episode, but also other lines that feel unique to who Ian and Rachel are. But Ian has no trouble remembering Jamie's words of advice, and it turns out Rachel isn't always interested in being gentle either, which leads to a rather enjoyable evening for both of them. Meanwhile, as we check in with the older marrieds, Jamie is having trouble sleeping. At first, he claims it's because they're still in the bed where Claire and John were intimate. But it turns out Jamie's anxieties also lie with being the one who turned John over to be hanged by the rebels, to say nothing of William, who seems to be missing in action this week as well. In the morning, we get an answer to at least one of these questions. But it involves John being found sleeping on the cold ground and pretending his name is Bertram Armstrong so he isn't killed on the spot by the Continental Army. As Ian and Rachel find any excuse they can to linger in bed a while longer, Jamie dons his new uniform as a brigadier general, bemoaning the thought of having to drag Claire back onto the battlefront. "Bloody men," Claire says affectionately. "When will you realize you're not dragging us anywhere?" After an entire episode devoted to other storylines, this week finally checks back in with Roger and Buck back in 1739. Buck starts to wax poetic about Scotland's mountains, but it jogs Roger's memory about something Brianna said to him once, about feeling a pull similar to the stones around the dam where she works. The dam won't be there now, of course, but there could very well be stones in its place. Stones that were responsible for bringing Roger's father back through time. Retracing the path Jeremiah might have taken is as good a plan as any and could bring them one step closer to the man himself. Discovering the stone circle, they find a World War II survival kit, army rations included, and while there's a moment when the show tries to convince us that Jem might have come through the stones after all, it's a local kid, carrying the helmet belonging to Roger's father, who tries to run away. After some not-so-subtle threats from Buck, the kid spills the dirt. A strangely dressed man stole a sheep from someone in the village, so he ratted him out for it. The man escaped into the woods, but his days with both hands intact are likely numbered since theft isn't looked too kindly upon. It turns out Roger and Buck haven't been led astray this time. They find a man in a sheepskin bomber jacket gathering firewood, but before he can turn tail and run, Roger calls out to him as Jerry, knowing his father's nickname will stop him in his tracks. Shout out to Outlander's casting department, by the way. The resemblance between these two is uncanny. Rattling off a series of historical facts to convince Jeremiah of the truth, Roger knows there's only so much he can tell his father about the future, including who he really is. It's then that he gets the story of what happened to his father. His plane had gone down on the moors during a test flight, and he's found the stone circle while looking for the closest village. When he'd leaned against one of the stones to rest, he's woken up in 1739. Their conversation is cut short when the three men realize Jerry's still being hunted, and from that point on, it's a mad dash back to the stones. Roger drops a gem into his father's hand and urges him to go back to his own time, to his wife and son. When confronted with the chance to reveal the truth of his own identity, though, Roger only tells Jerry that the war will be won through the actions of men like him. After his father disappears through the stones, Roger considers the possibility that he'd been brought back to 1739, not to save one Jeremiah, but another, and that his son may have never come through the stones at all. 14th episode kicks off with the confirmation that Jamie and Claire will be hosting a very important dinner, with guests including General George Washington. It's a dinner that the Frasers only find out about on the day, much to Mrs. Figg's consternation. And for a moment, I was confused about why they'd be able to host high-ranking members of the Continental Army at Lord John's house. But apparently, the Loyalists have been forced to flee Philadelphia, clearing the way for the show to go on. While out shopping in the market, Claire accidentally collides with a charming Frenchman dressed in continental blues, who swiftly introduces himself to her as the Marquis de Lafayette and promises to make amends for his clumsiness via a delivery of Roquefort. If only all disputes could be settled with a gift of cheese, am I right? After Claire learns that Lafayette will be among the guests in her home that evening, the scene cuts to that very dinner, where Washington is sitting at the head of the table and Jamie is rocking his new uniform as Brigadier General. At one point, to thank the Frasers for their generosity, Washington gifts them a United States flag. The early design, featuring 13 stars and stripes. It's a significant moment, not only because Claire and Jamie are once again living through a major turning point in history in the Revolutionary War, but because they know they're fighting on the winning side, unlike the known losses that awaited them heading into Culloden. Lafayette hand-delivers some imported eel from France, which Claire samples just to be polite, even if she appears to be one bite away from spitting it out in her napkin, and toasts to the US of A and the prospect of victory end the meal on a more optimistic note. The aforementioned gift of cheese, however, is enjoyed later that night, as Jamie and Claire wind down from dinner in their bedroom. But Jamie confesses that he's starting to feel the weight of his new position, with 300 souls under his command when he's never led more than 50 in the past. As Claire reminds him, it's an impressive position, but it doesn't change the fact that some of these men will likely be lost before the war is over. Morning dawns bright and cold at camp, as Jamie inspects the young soldiers who are reporting in for duty, while Claire looks over anyone who might be dealing with some lingering sickness, including consumption. Among those wandering into her tent, though, is Lord John Grey himself, aka Bertram Armstrong, who's just sworn an oath of loyalty to the Continental Army for his own protection, but agrees to surrender himself into Jamie's custody right then and there. Back at John's house, Claire takes advantage of the opportunity to inspect the man's injured eye, which hasn't healed quite right. In order to fix the issue, though, she apparently has to reach into the socket, grab the eyeball, and move it into the proper position. I'm shocked that there are no tools that seem to be available for this task. Claire just goes in with her bare hands as Jamie holds John steady in the chair. But at the end of it all, John's eye does look much improved, if still a little bruised. He's going to have to remain a prisoner, in his own home no less, but at least he's not walking into any clear danger, right? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. After leaving Jem and Mandy safely in the custody of Ernie and Fiona Buchan, Brianna drives back to Lallybroch, only to find that she's just missed the locksmith who dropped by to replace all the locks on the house. With Rob Cameron still in possession of a key, he could come back at any time. So Brianna's already on high alert when she notices a light on in one of the upstairs rooms. Rather than go inside, she drives away from the house, grabbing a shotgun out of the trunk and sneaking back to the property on foot. From her vantage point in the bushes, she watches more lights come on, revealing at least 2 masked men inside waiting for her. Accomplices of Rob's, no doubt, but it's still incredibly satisfying to hear Brianna refer to them as the 2F** king bastards in house. Just then, to Bree's dismay, Ernie and Fiona pull up, drawing the attention of the men from inside. Brianna runs at their van, yelling at Jem to get back in just as he hops out, and fires a series of warning shots at the men coming out the front door to hold them back. In the chaos that follows, Ernie initially can't get his van restarted, but Brianna lands a punch on one man and lifts his mask to reveal his face before they successfully reverse out of there. Rob Cameron even pulls up in his own truck, locking eyes with Brianna through the windshield before she orders Ernie to keep driving until they can get a safe distance away. Later on, Fiona admits she and Ernie drove back to Lallybroch when they'd realized Rob was hanging around outside their home, figuring Brianna might be walking into similar danger. In that moment, Brianna realizes she needs to move forward with a new plan, taking the kids back through the stones to Roger and to safety. After what amounted to a pretty rough week for William back in episode 12, the young captain is looking pretty worse for wear by the time he reports to the British camp. He earns a dressing down from his superior officer for the state of his uniform, as well as his missing gorget, which, if you'll recall, he had used as payment for a night with Jane Pocock. It turns out that both gorget and girl aren't far away, as the young woman conveniently stumbles into William's tent along with her little sister, Fanny. William is, quite understandably, surprised to see Jane again, and she is frustratingly obtuse about her reasons for both her and Fanny being at camp, apart from a brief mention of the nefarious Captain Harkness. Initially, Jane proposes a deal with William. If he offers his protection to her and Fanny, she'll be there for him in a much more intimate capacity. But William, intent on retaining his honor, accepts no such deal, suggesting that Jane work as his personal laundress instead. That exchange leads to even more confusion on William's part when Jane initially states that she doesn't know how to do laundry, much less how to buy the materials she'd need for the job, until she calmly explains to him that she's never been in a position to handle real money or have knowledge of what things actually cost outside the brothel. All the wages she ever earned there went straight to the madam for upkeep and other expenses, so she wouldn't know whether she's being swindled or not. That initial hurdle between the two is followed by a failed attempt at seduction. Although William does initiate a kiss of his own after Jane moves to leave his tent, without pressing for more. If there's going to be more intimacy between them, he's willing to wait until it's something that Jane really wants, rather than feeling obligated to initiate it in return for keeping her and Fanny safe. Since doing laundry is clearly low on Jane's list of favorite tasks, it doesn't take long at all for the truth to finally come out about why the sisters fled their circumstances. Jane tells William that Harkness ultimately returned to the brothel, not for her, but for Fanny and her virginity. Since Jane already had knowledge of the captain's violent nature, she knew she had to intervene and ultimately stabbed Harkness in the throat with a kitchen knife. With a British officer now dead at her hand, Jane knew they'd have to run, with the intention of ultimately making it to New York and away from prosecution. William promises he won't turn Jane over to a magistrate and begs her to stay with him, but he's got another problem to deal with. After being summoned by Captain Richardson to hand-deliver a message to a group of Hessians camped at Spotswood, the young man sets off immediately. What he doesn't know, and what we do, is that Richardson is a double agent working for the Continental Army, and this isn't the first time he's targeted the perceived son of Lord John by sending him into danger. William thinks he's the courier for a vital letter, but he's actually handing a cipher to a gang that will take him captive and likely torture him with the goal of ensuring John's cooperation. After receiving advance warning of the plan from his stepbrother and former lover, Percy Beauchamp, John sits down with the Frasers, who realize they'll have to release him from house arrest so he can ride to Spotswood and rescue William, with pistol-packing assistance from a happily married Ian, of course. "Save our son," Jamie urges, "and I've got to admit, I've been waiting for this heroic side of Lord John Grey to show up all along." 15th episode begins as the morning of the Battle of Monmouth in 1778 dawns almost too peacefully with the distant playing of drums, but Jamie has clearly already been awake for hours when Claire finally rolls over in their tent to check on him. It's only one of the scenes in which Jamie ends up monologuing to captivating ends. It initially seems strange at first to hear Jamie wax nostalgic about Ellen's death, but then he admits that he lost his mother so young that she never even had a single gray hair on her head. Seeing all the gray in Claire's hair now, Jamie says, is a reminder of how many years they've had together and how much longer she's lived. It doesn't seem like an ominous remark at the time, but in hindsight, Jamie isn't the one who needs their love to shield him from the dangers of battle. As she prepares to send Jamie off to the front lines, Claire refuses to say anything that could be construed as eternally parting words, while Jamie confesses that he wishes his last words to William hadn't been issued in anger. It's here, too, that we're given the first of several scenes featuring a sepia-toned Jamie and Claire, sitting by the campfire with nothing but stars overhead. Initially, these moments seem conjured by Claire pausing to reflect here and there, but, as the episode eventually reveals, they might have an even more devastating significance. For the moment, however, Claire's too busy dealing with the Army's doctor, Captain Leckie, who readily dismisses her medical expertise solely because of her gender, despite Denzel Hunter's protests. After both of them try and fail to plead her value to Leckie, Claire and Rachel take point on triage in tents outside the church, which has been turned into a makeshift hospital. Later, Claire brings an injured soldier into the church herself as the battle begins to rage, and Leckie initially protests her diagnosis of a pneumothorax, but when her aspiration technique saves the man's life, the doctor is clearly forced to eat his words. Nothing hits better than Claire's competency shining through, especially when men have to shut up and let her do what she's best at. Back in 1739, Roger and Buck have set up camp by the river after sending Roger's father back to his own time. An emotional farewell, to be sure, but one that clearly has Roger thinking about the importance of family. At the very least, it's left him more inclined to spill the beans to Buck about the other man's true parentage, now that they're literally out in the middle of nowhere. Initially, Roger broaches the subject by admitting that Buck's mother is a time traveler too, but it doesn't take long for the rest of the truth to come out. Understandably, Buck feels like an idiot for not realizing that Gillis Duncan was his birth mother while he was literally in the woman's home. Not to mention after his father, Dougal Mackenzie, showed up for their first meet-cute in the process. But Roger admits he was afraid that if Buck had learned the truth too soon, he might have done something that could have changed the course of history, and potentially even resulted in him never even being born. Buck storms off in a moment of frustration, but then rightfully points out that Dougal had only showed up at Gillis's house looking for Roger. So who knows if his parents would have ever met otherwise. Meanwhile, Lord John Grey and Ian have caught up to the Hessians who are holding William captive. At first, they fib their way into the camp by claiming they've arrived per Captain Richardson's orders, but their leader, Oberst, is immediately skeptical of their story. Still, he agrees to bring William out so the two can verify that he's mostly unharmed, if a little battered and bruised. A tense standoff ensues, as the Hessians refuse to turn over William, but before one of them can even so much as pull out his pistol, John kills him with a single shot. Bullets are exchanged, and Ian allows Oberst to escape as John frees William from his shackles, but then thinks better of it when the Hessian warns him that he will live to regret the decision one day. Perhaps Ian's thinking of Arch Bug and doesn't want to live the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, especially when he has his new wife's safety to concern himself with now. After parting ways with John and William, Ian doubles back, tracks Oberst down, and kills the Hessian with a knife to the chest. It seems that Rachel's fear that her husband wouldn't be capable of making the tough choice to kill is unfounded, but Ian seems poised to be changed forever now that he has more blood on his hands. Back at Lallybroch, at two different points in time, Roger and Brianna have the same idea when it comes to checking in with each other, leaving a letter inside the desk in the Laird's study. Before Brianna can drop in her own message for Roger to find, another drawer pops open to reveal his letter. Now, Bree knows exactly where he's traveled back to, 1739, so a reunion for this family seems all but imminent, especially once she brings both of her kids back to the Stones, and Mandy gets a running head start. Things aren't going as smoothly for William, by contrast. Once he and John make it back to the British camp, as he learns from a tearful Fanny that Jane has been arrested for the murder of Captain Harkness in his absence. But does William have enough authority to stop her hanging from taking place? Historically, the Battle of Monmouth was something of a lost cause for both sides, with neither the Continentals nor the British really landing a decisive victory. So perhaps Claire was onto something when she admitted to having a bad feeling about it. Now that the British have been forced into retreating, however, their trek will take them right past where Claire, Rachel, Denzel, and the others are camped tending to the wounded. And everyone has been ordered to evacuate before the platoon of redcoats arrives. But Claire digs her heels in, refusing to abandon the injured men she has an obligation to, even as Lecky pleads with her to leave. Finally, respectfully addressing her as Dr. Fraser, the captain prepares to depart with everyone else, just in time for Claire to receive the news that an unharmed Jamie is on his way back too. But the British passing by in such close quarters to similarly armed Continental soldiers leads to a rather predictable outcome, in which insults are traded, guns are flashed, and bullets are exchanged. Before Jamie can successfully order his men to stand down, he realizes Claire has been shot in the abdomen. After carrying a bleeding Claire into the church where others are sheltered in place, Jamie is dismayed to learn that Lecky, for all his proper medical training, can do nothing to remove the bullet. But Jamie not only refuses to let his wife die, he refuses to leave his wife, period, even when he's ordered to do so. In what could be considered one of the most badass moves of the series, Jamie commands one of his soldiers to strip off his coat and shirt, dips his fingers in Claire's blood, and uses it to write an official resignation of his commission as Brigadier General on the man's naked back. While Claire fights to remain conscious, she manages to tell Jamie to fetch Denzel, the only doctor who might be capable of performing the surgery to remove the bullet. As Claire hovers on the precipice between life and death, Jamie prays over her, begging God not to take his wife from him. Thankfully, Denzel and Rachel arrive just in time, bearing another thoughtful gift basket from Lafayette himself. Claire, recalling the Roquefort, reminds Denzel that the cheese's mold can be used to make penicillin, for after the procedure, and as Dr. Hunter begins his work, asking Jamie to resume his praying, we see the night sky from Claire's point of view, with one star still burning, even as the rest fades to black. 16th episode of Outlander Season 7 begins with a flashback of little Jane, Francis, and their mother, who has red curly hair. Yes, the description is important. At present, Jane refuses to cooperate with the Inquisitor. He suggests she use her last words wisely as they will reach Francis. Meanwhile, Claire wakes up and Jamie is glad to see her alive. She is her usual droll self, albeit a little weak. With more good news, Ian returns and updates Jamie that William has been rescued. A week later, Claire is much better, but she feels humiliated that Jamie has to help her with everything. He does it all without complaint, and she loves him for it. She wants to go home, and he promises to take her. Not to forget the hunters. Denzel is overwhelmed as he was worried he would fail Claire. She comforts him and hopes she can be strong like him if she finds herself in a similar medical situation. As for Rachel, she is pregnant and agrees to settle at Fraser's Ridge. Ian's happiness is short-lived as Rollo dies. Rachel comforts him, and he realizes that Rollo waited till he had someone before passing on. John visits Claire, and their usual camaraderie annoys Jamie. He is still holding a grudge and bickers with John once he is sure William is safe. John goads him as well, but they have a tense truce. Tired of their passive aggressiveness, Claire interrupts. She thanks John for saving her life. He kisses her hand and leaves, while Jamie continues to glare daggers at him. After William's failed mission to save Jane, he decides to ask Jamie about his birth. Jamie claims it was consensual, but he didn't love Geneva, William's mother. William believes she was horrible, but Jamie defends her, calling her brave. William wonders if he regrets it, and Jamie says no as he smiles and holds William. They are reminded of their happy times on the Hellwater estate. However, William states that he will never call Jamie his father. In 1739, Jem, Mandy, and Brianna all make it safely to Lallybroch and reunite with Roger. Buck feels bittersweet before joining their family hug. Brian feels connected to Brianna as she looks like she could be his child. She laughs it off, but shares that there are times when people are inexplicably drawn to others. She also adds that he reminds her of Jamie and his devotion. In return, he looks sad as he reveals that he has not moved on after his wife, Ellen's death. Brianna and Roger finally spend time together. He confesses that he misses his dad and worries about him. Similarly, Brianna misses her parents, and they wonder if they can go back to living with the Frasers now that Mandy is healthy. William asks John for his help to free Jane. However, Jane has already confessed, and William cannot testify for her as there will be no trial. John comforts him as he reveals she will be executed under martial law. William doesn't want to, but he asks for Jamie's help in rescuing Jane. They break into the house with a trick Brianna had taught Jamie. William remembers her and realizes she is his sister. They reach too late and find that Jane has slit her wrists. William is heartbroken, and Jamie has to drag him away as the soldiers arrive. William takes Frances to the Frasers, who invite her to live on the ridge with them. One night, Claire dreams of Master Raymond, the chemist who helped her when she gave birth to the stillborn Faith. In her dream, he asks for her forgiveness. She recalls how Raymond believed the Frasers would see Faith one day. Jamie is sure they will all be reunited in heaven. After Jane is buried in an unmarked grave, the Frasers accompany Frances to the site. Claire comforts her by asking her to talk about Jane. Frances talks about how they played with dragonflies and shows Claire a portrait locket of her mother. The woman has red curly hair, and her name is Faith. A while later, the Frasers get ready to leave for the ridge. Claire goes to get Frances, who is singing, "I Do Like to Be Beside the Seaside." She is shocked as it is a 20th century song which she sang to Faith before she was buried. She asks Frances about it, and the girl claims her mother taught her the song. At the end of Outlander Season 7, Episode 16, Jamie finds a distressed Claire. She is teary-eyed as she tells him that she thinks Faith lived, which would make Jane and Frances the granddaughters of Jamie and Claire.